From money to the moon, the US and the USSR had a complicated relationship from the start. Known as the most dangerous 13 days in history, the Cuban Missile Crisis took place from October 16 through October 29, 1962.
The ambitious leader of the USSR, Stalin, attempted to spread communist ideas throughout the entirety of the world, beginning with the satellite states such as Romania and Bulgaria, and soon spreading to nations in Western Europe. Half a world away, the United States was the most industrialized nation in the world, and wanted to preserve its power. Due to the physical separation of their country from Europe, they felt it all the more important to push into Europe by spreading their capitalist ideology. Previously, during World War II, the US was able to coexist with the USSR as they fought the common enemy of the Axis powers. Just 2 decades later, these soldiers would be fighting on opposite sides. With many countries barely getting on their feet from the devastating events of World War II, it was easy for the two superpowers to bribe countries in alliances with them. The US provided financial aid to Turkey and Greece through the Truman Doctrine, which was a public statement that the US would work to contain communism. This sentiment would continue with the Marshall Plan, which provided $13 billion to Western Europe and the creation of NATO, an organization of the US and Western European countries who promised to defend each other in case of an attack by the Soviets. This resulted in the Iron Curtain rising between Western and Eastern Europe. However, for the people of the US, these were distant struggles that didn't begin to touch their day-to-day until
October 16, 1962, when a U-2 plane flying over Cuba was spotted developing military sites. In 1955, the Cuban Revolution took place in which Fidel Castro took control over the island. He attempted to implement communism into the government, but this required a steady stream of resources that Cuba could simply not maintain. The USSR saw this as a perfect opportunity to step in with its deep pockets. It traded sugar, military equipment, food, and engineers with Cuba. While seemingly helpful just for Cuba, their partnership was important as the USSR was then able to pose a meaningful threat to the United States due to the close proximity of the two nations. Due to this, the US was immensely skeptical of why Cuba suddenly had expensive military sites being set up, and it wasn't a far stretch to pin the blame on the Soviets. October 17th confirmed these tensions as CIA analysts noticed that these sites were missile sites built by the Soviet Union. The photograph indicates the presence of launchers, which are vehicles for transport of missiles. These new military sites had the capacity to reach all of southeastern United States, including Washington, D.C. The first contact was made with the USSR on October 18th when Gromyko, the Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, met with John F. Kennedy in the Oval Office. However, these talks proved to be futile as both parties pretended to be under a mask of ignorance and refused to directly approach the issue. Dancing around the topic, Gromyko claimed that USSR involvement was purely defensive and posed no threat to the United States. Obviously not believing this, the president began to discuss further actions with his cabinet. The objective was to eliminate these missiles by airstrikes and prevent more missiles from entering Cuba throughout the quarantine. Meanwhile, the public remained oblivious to these threats as John F. Kennedy continued to travel for his campaign trips. But while John F. Kennedy was enjoying his time on his tour of the States, the White House was in a midst of chaos debating what their next steps are going to be, which would dictate the fate of humanity. However, none of these steps could be enacted without presidential approval, so on October 20th, John F. Kennedy's doctors helped him fake a cold so he could fly back to Washington, D.C. There, the National Security Council began to draft up the blockade plans and the announcement to the public. Kennedy's schedule was waterlogged in meetings as one wrong move would lead to USSR retaliation and potential nuclear warfare. On October 22nd, John F. Kennedy made a public statement announcing,
"Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere."
The crisis was made known globally when, on October 23rd, Ambassador Stevenson presented it to the United Nations Security Council and announced that the U.S. would be instituting a quarantine around Cuba. Kennedy warned Khrushchev to stop sending Soviet ships into Cuban waters as the blockade was tasked to open fire on any invaders in the waters surrounding the country. Surprisingly, Khrushchev did not find this quarantine amusing. In his reply, which came through on October 24th, he said, "You, Mr. President, are not declaring a quarantine, but rather are setting forth an ultimatum and threatening if we do not give in to your demands, you will use force. Consider what you're saying, and you want to persuade me to agree to this?" As the two countries were effectively stuck in a stalemate, many politicians, including UN Secretary General U Thant, urged them both to walk away. While some were trying to walk away unscathed, Fidel Castro wrote to Khrushchev to launch an attack on the United States. This finally made Khrushchev realize the severity of the issue, and he wrote to Kennedy proposing the removal of missiles in exchange for a lifting of the naval blockade and a promise to never invade Cuba. However, another letter arrived on the next day revealing that these Cuban missiles were just a reaction to the missiles John F. Kennedy had stationed in Turkey pointing to the USSR. Kennedy, realizing that the lives of millions were not worth the little advantage he had over the Soviet Union, agreed to the terms that he would remove the missiles from Turkey and lift the naval blockade in exchange for the Soviet Union removing the missiles from Cuba.
During the prolonged time before the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, fear was spread amongst American and Soviet leaders. A hotline was made between these two superpowers in which both nations must detail the placement of their nuclear weapons to ensure no surprise attacks, as this is what the U.S. was fearful of during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
After all, just like Kennedy
So let
said,
us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
Some steps to decrease the chance of a global nuclear warfare included the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, which stopped the US and USSR from giving missiles to their allies or satellite states. This was a very clear nod to the Cuban Missile Crisis and US missiles in Turkey. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, was an agreement for both nations to slow their internal development of these bombs. While these steps were meant to benefit all of humankind, many radicals in the USSR saw this as a weakening of government and were displeased with the way Khrushchev handled removing the advantage the USSR had over the US. Khrushchev was disposed by his military opponents and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. While this change in government was meant to strengthen the USSR, this sudden shift of power showed the cracks in the leadership and unity of the USSR, which allowed for the détente to begin. The détente was a shift in the way the US and the USSR approached the advancement of their countries. Rather than competing against each other, they would combine efforts for all the people of the world. This was most clearly seen in the space race, which originally started as a competition to launch the first satellite into space.
However, with this newfound goal of joint progress, the United States and USSR worked together to launch Apollo-Soyuz, the first crewed international space mission, and a metaphorical handshake in space.
The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point of international relations between the US and the Soviet Union. Before the crisis, fear and intimidation ruled the two superpowers' relationship. However, nuclear conflict only seemed to be a distant possibility. Then, all of a sudden, the two countries stood on the brink of nuclear warfare. Through 13 days of intense negotiation and communication, the nations finally stood down. In the following years, both countries took steps towards avoiding future disputes over nuclear weapons and changed their foreign policies. Today, we see the revolutionary change caused by this event because we ensured to never approach nuclear conflict the same way.